Greetings and welcome to Coffee Breaks with Scholars, a series of research and scholarship-informed conversations between diversity scholars and experts on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's conversation will focus on how institutions of higher education can better serve first-generation, low-income, and/or students of color, with particular emphasis on how today's current events have shaped our understanding of these students' experiences. Coffee Breaks with Scholars is presented by the Diversity Scholars Network and the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. Our coffee break today features Dr. Bedelia Richards, Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Richmond, Dr. Anthony Abraham Jack, Junior Fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and Assistant Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Dr. Elizabeth M. Lee, Assistant Professor of Sociology at St. Joseph's University, and Dr. Carson Byrd, Scholar in Residence at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan and Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Louisville. With that, I will give our esteemed scholars the opportunity to introduce themselves a bit further, provide some opening comments, and then engage in a discussion about today's topic.
All right, folks. My name is Bedelia Richards, and I am an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Richmond. I am also the founder of Race Talk LLC, which provides workshops and other consulting services for administrators, faculty, and student leaders in higher ed. My work broadly focuses on interrogating racism and classism in higher education institutions. I'm also really committed to engaging more in kind of public scholarship and really finding solutions to social problems that exist in the world. Some of the work that I'm really focused on right now really explores the transition from high school to college among Black and Latinx students. And I've also, in my kind of public scholarship, really focused on how to create, how to address anti-Blackness on predominantly white campuses. I've also really been interested in exploring how to address race and gender bias in student evaluations, which is something that really perpetuates institutionalized racism in the academy. And so that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm really excited to be here with my colleagues. What I'm really interested in talking about as I think about what higher education can do kind of post this pandemic to focus on issues of equity is that one of the things that I'd really like to talk about with my colleagues is I think that we really need to, higher ed institutions really need to shift from a diversity framework to an anti-racist and equity kind of framework. I also want to have some conversations about admissions policies and the role that might play in really addressing some of the inequities in higher ed. And I really want to talk about hostile racial climates, just hostile climates period, but especially hostile racial climates and what institutions can do to address that. So I'm hoping that our conversation can delve into some of these topics.
Yeah. I'm all here for that. I'm so excited about this conversation. People who I have read and cited and got to know in person. Thank you for this invitation to be with you all today. I'm Anthony Abraham Jack. I'm an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the assistant professor at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I am very much interested in students who are first in their families to go to college. My research predominantly focuses on lower income and first generation college students, especially at schools that have changed their admissions policy to be more, for lack of a better word, progressive in their outreach. So have adopted both class-based and race-based affirmative action measures to increase diversity on their campus. But my research wants to investigate, well, what happens when those students get on campus, right? You have extended these coveted invitations, but have you prepared for the occasion? What are the ways in which a lot of what we see on the college campus that has one that has changed its admissions policy, has done the outreach, but it's a lot of the same, and wonder why certain students don't feel accepted, acclimated, integrated into the school, and what are the consequences of that. I do like to use research to actually engage the public. I hope we talk about this, the difference between being a public intellectual and an intellectual who engages the public, because I definitely consider myself more of the latter than the former. I have a general rule, and I can share this with you all, and we can interrogate. If it's more than 1 degree of separation away from my research, I tend not to comment on it. I don't want to be, commenting on everything. But what does that mean? What is the extra responsibility that has for scholars, but especially for scholars of color and women, especially given the kind of extra policing that we have of all of our activities. So I'm very, conscious when I write for the New York Times or the Washington Post or other outlets and different things like that about students who are first in their family, admissions, affirmative action, the cheating scandal to get into admissions and things like that. I hope we can talk about public engagement. I hope we can talk about a lot of the things that Bedelia mentioned. I hope we can also talk about whether universities should move away from the SAT for now and forever. And I hope we can unpack some of the things about social class on the college campus that goes beyond financial aid.
There's already so much to respond to. This is very exciting. Okay, so I'm Elizabeth Lee. My research focuses mostly on day-to-day experiences of class inequality in higher education contexts, and increasingly on the ways that those experiences are also raced and gendered. Most of my research is with students. I also do research on faculty experiences. I'm really excited about the topics that have already been named. And I'll add that one of the things that I've been thinking about is the relationship between a college campus and college students. Both the relationship that we promise, the relationship that we market and offer to students, and the relationship that we actually have, which particularly for students from lower income, first gen, working class, and Black students, Latinx students, Native American students, and some groups of Asian American students, really falls short in the ways that Bedelia and Tony have already mentioned. Part of my thinking about this is that I've been doing research with student organizers, and I've seen the tremendous amount of work that students are doing to advocate for one another, to make change. And on the one hand, that's very exciting to see students taking on that work. On the other hand, it's incredibly frustrating, not least because they are overburdened and exhausted, and they're getting huge amounts of pushback from their administrations. And students have already been engaged in this kind of equity work for decades around race equity and gender equity. So part of what I'd like to talk about, and I know is on the table for today, is how can our campuses move away from what are effectively antagonistic positions towards their students, and to being more effective responding to student needs, and moving away from situations where students are presumed to have particular resources on hand and available to them. In other words, moving away from structuring in an assumption about who the typical student is, and really taking into account a much broader range of student backgrounds and experiences.
I don't think there's anything I really need to cover. I'm just going to be back here just along for the ride. So I'm Carson Byrd. I'm scholar in residence in National Center for Institutional Diversity in the Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and also an associate professor of sociology at the University of Louisville. I mean, my work overlaps with everyone's here, really centering on how systemic inequality is embedded within and emanates from higher education, specifically around racism and classism. But a lot of what I've been really working on recently is kind of getting to what everyone else has spoken to in terms of how do our policies, how do our administrative and institutional positions really undercut some of the goals that they speak about and kind of symbolically hold up high, but then everything that seems to be happening that isn't coming from a lot of, you know, the student-centered positions or the student labor, as Liz was mentioning, is, you know, really just undercutting all of that and most of the times impeding it. So a lot of what I'm working on right now is how does the quantification of diversity and inclusion in higher education, how does aiming for the numbers, how does embedding these things as certain measurable goods make diversity and inclusion marketable, make student widgets, make you know, faculty of color and women widgets for producing these things and undercutting and undervaluing them. And a lot of what I've been thinking about in recent weeks is, you know, we're talking about the pandemic, but a lot of these inequities that we're seeing have always been there, right? And so I think everybody here is pretty much on point of saying we've got a lot of work to do and trying to figure out what, you know, when everything goes back to normal, what that might look like. You know, before the pandemic, 50% of all students were facing housing and food insecurity, and now it's at least 60%, 70% of Black students, 70% of Native American Indigenous students, 60 to 2/3 fully of all Asian Pacific Islander students, Middle Eastern students, half of all white students are facing this now. They've all lost jobs, internships, their families are losing this. So what normal looks like isn't going to look like the recovery and the great, you know, following the Great Recession. So a lot of this, I think, is on us to figure out, you know, why are we still thinking that there is going to be a normal and romanticizing the somewhat the good old days that never actually existed, right? So I'm really looking forward to kind of, maybe we can figure this all out in 45 minutes, right?
Yeah. You know, as I reflect on the questions about what higher ed can do to support first-gen students, students of color, working class students, one of the things that I thought about is that it also depends on like what kind of institutions are we talking about. You know, are we talking about institutions that you know, serve traditional age students, you know, where I work, or are we talking about institutions that serve adult learners, people who may also themselves have children? We're talking about community colleges, you know, are we talking about, you know, schools that serve primarily kind of economically privileged students, or we're talking about, you know, institutions that kind of don't. And as, you know, as I thought about the question, I really had to think about that, because I realized that as I was thinking about my answers, that I was also, you know, even though I know this, that I was thinking about particular context in which I work, and I had to kind of think about like, you know, this is one context. And so, you know, some of the things that we may think about, now some of the things that I'm going to talk about really applies across context, but I think it's important to realize that we have to consider the particular context and needs of students to be able to really kind of address, right, that question. But one of the things that I, you know, as I think about what would kind of cut across is that I'm not going to talk about anything in like a concrete action, but it's more about how we think about the problem, because how we think about the problem does influence the kinds of solutions that we come up with. And I think that what I would like to see happen is the shift from this diversity framework that we're using in higher ed to kind of address the range of human differences on campus and inequalities on campus, and move towards an anti-racist and equity-minded lens. And I think I say that because, you know, as we think about how popular this terminology is, like that should be an indicator, right, that institutions are embracing it so much. And I realized that I think one of the reasons why it is so popular is because, you know, think about kind of one of the reasons it even emerged, right, as kind of an alternative to affirmative action. So we're talking about a specific kind of inequality, and one that's rooted in kind of historical injustice, where there's kind of a debt, right? To say that that's not something that we need to consider. Like, we need to think about more like the range of diversity. And so it opens it up, and a lot of scholars have written about this, to all kinds of differences, right? And that itself then takes attention away from issues of race. But what that also does, and I see this happening even on my campus, is that it allows us to define white men, right, who are the most privileged and powerful group in the United States of America, as a minority that needs protection. Like, that's what the diversity framework allows us to do, which is really problematic. So for me, that's one of the things that I would love to see institutions do. And I can think of maybe one or two institutions that embrace the title of antiracist, right? Like, this is what we aspire to be. In terms of thinking about kind of an equity, using an equity lens and thinking in particular about first-gen students and working class students, I think one of the things that I'd like institutions to do is to recognize that it's okay to kind of target students and provide specific kinds of supports to students who might need something that other students do not. So I think that's one thing that I would like institutions to be thinking about. And I think that goes back to earlier me talking about like, what are the kinds of institutions and what are the kind of demographics of students who are there. And I think that makes me think about Anthony's comment he made earlier about like funding, and thinking about like, how do we think differently about, you know, funding and who should get it, what we use it for, and who is centered. So I think I will end by saying that in terms of thinking it through that equity lens, I'd like institutions to think about who is being centered in the decision-making process, right? As they think about being more equity-minded or addressing inequities on college campuses. So I'll just stop there in terms of like, right now I just want them to think differently about the problem before I even think about what are some of the, you know, ways that I would like, things that I would actually like them to do.
Can I add on?
Yes.
I really like that you're, I'm with you on the sort of, we need to change how we think about things, and that's a really fundamental step. And needs to be a very early step. And one of the frustrations that I have, and again, other people certainly have this as well with the diversity framing, is the way that it also, you just mentioned centering. It centers and makes some students normative, and then other students are the providers of this diversity, in a way that then becomes, you're not just, you know, a student who is intellectually capable and brings, you know, lots of wonderful things to the table like any other student. You're also a diversity student, and you have this extra special role to play. And it also contributes to the kinds of conversations and Eli Anderson uses the term invidious distinctions, invidious comparisons of, oh, then you're a, you know, like we hear in the workplace, a diversity hire or a diversity student. And it allows this delegitimizing narrative. And I think being more concrete about the goals involved is one step that's important in and of itself, but also important in moving away from some of that, some of those sort of side effects of diversity language.
Yeah, you know what? And I mean, I'm in agreement. I mean, the only thing I would adjust a little bit is the extra responsibility on women and students of color, let alone the combination thereof. It's their job to teach, their job to be the representative. So it's not just it's not just the added things, added responsibilities that you have to have when you have the diversity framework. And I mean, you know, and I think what's going to be interesting is how in this move will that diversity hire went from being a derogatory statement against some people to actually now, when people do take an anti-racist and an equity framework, will diversity hires be seen as an actual response to what the original affirmative action and those kind of policies we're trying to address, right? When we think about actual, like the generational inequalities that have been created because of exclusion, racism, and power differentials between racial groups, right? And so it's just very interesting. But what I'm afraid of is for universities to run so quickly to anti-racist before they actually understand what it is. Because what I don't want is basically now universities to call every Black professor that you know, every Latin professor that you know, and get them to tell you their story, and therefore you can create policies, and that's how we are not going to do it. I mean, if we could take a survey right now of every single Black PhD in the academy and ask them how many times that they have been called or requested a meeting to talk about something, or can you teach me a little bit more about what Ibram Kendi means when he says be anti-racist, because that's not enough, right? How many times have we received that kind of notification? And you want people to do the work, but I want people to do the work in a way that actually it sticks and it sinks in, because if we go too quickly, it's going to be like what happens when they do any kind of pilot program. They're going to find some metric on which it is not working at 100%. And they're like, oh, it's pilot, we tried it, let's go back to kind of what we were, or what we're used to, or what we're more used to. And so I do worry about that. But I am in agreement. I think, the shutting down of college campuses across the board, state, community colleges, small privates, show why we need the equity framework and why we do need more targeted policies. And, I talked to a number of college deans and presidents in their decision to not just if they should shut down. That was a yes or no, and that was an easy yes, you should, but how you should. How do you roll it out? You really saw who had a more equity, whose senior leadership had a more equity focus in their policy, in their outlining of policy, than those who did not. Because there were some people who just let general counsel dictate the closing policies, and then they were scrambling to figure out how to help students leave. They were like, oh, your parents can't come pick you up and ship up all your stuff. Like, oh, you don't have internet at home, you don't have access to food. I'm just like, you know that because you read the admissions file. You know the very students who struggle with the things that to say that you take it for granted is an understatement. And all of a sudden, right after spring break, for most schools or around spring break, you're like, oh, just stay home. Who leaves? Who has a home to go to? Who feels safe at home? Who has the resources to be a full student there, right? If we had greater access to that kind of thinking, we would have been in a much better place to prepare, not just for COVID, but for a lot of other smaller things that actually lead to just as deleterious effects.
Yeah, and I mean, saying I agree with everybody is an understatement. I think one of the things, about moving forward is not repeating the failures of the past as we're reopening campuses and trying to support students, right? Like that requires, as Bedelia was mentioning, an equity framework, an anti-racism framework that most institutions haven't even figured out how to implement before all this happened. And so, trying to figure out, if we're going to reopen campuses, which, a majority, it was at 65% of institutions are like, yeah, we're going to bring everybody back. Cool. So when you send them away, because we haven't even gotten out of the first wave of this pandemic, what are you going to do at the end of November and December when you repeat the same things that you did in March and April, right? The same failures of not, thinking about where students are coming from in terms of the opportunities to stay safe, maybe have access to the internet, maybe being on campus is the safest place for them, right? But now you're saying carte blanche, everybody's got to go. Right. There's a lot of what ifs that people are hoping to push down the road that, we're running to a dead end, right? Like we know something is going to happen in November, how bad it is, December, like generally speaking, that's when they're predicting this. We know something bad is going to happen probably, but we haven't really as Tony was mentioning, like, we know who our students are, but whether we actually consider them worthy of our time to fix this, that's an anti-racism kind of positioning, right? Like, saying, I understand that my students are different. They come from different backgrounds with different needs, and I haven't done a good job, but I'm going to try to do it now. Like, that's at least a reflexive kind of thing. Like, okay, we need to do something that we haven't done in the past. We need to commit to this. But to kind of circle back to the conversation about diversity hires, one of my biggest concerns is, how are people going to justify not making hires that are focusing on inequity globally, domestically, across the pond, around the corner, however we want to, frame it, to talk about educational inequity, health inequities, talk about, I don't know, police brutality and criminal justice system. How are we going to sit here and kind of say, well, we're hard up on money now, so we can invest in this now, but it's imperative that we do, right? And I think that, in addition to how we're seeing some institutions starting to flounder around like their admissions, like, oh, we're worried about tuition dollars, but you're not actually worried about supporting students and helping them be socially mobile in certain circumstances, helping sustain their dreams. Like, we're not even talking about the students. We're talking about dollars and cents, but it doesn't make sense at all, because it shows how much that people aren't being student-centered. They're thinking of a business model. And I get, like, dollars make the world go round, but at a certain point, like, you got to say that I'm still here for the students, right? And the faculty and staff, especially staff who are the most vulnerable people employed at the institution, that have the worst job security, the worst benefits, the worst protections of anything. But with the admissions, what's going to be interesting is people are saying, well, we're not really getting the students that we used to have. It's like, well, white wealthy students aren't the ones you should be aiming for anyway, right? Like, that shows exactly who you're most concerned about. Going back to what Bedelia was talking about with the diversity framework, that everybody who wasn't already here pre-civil rights movement are the additives to what we already got right. And it automatically makes them look like something is wrong with the student and with the faculty, and not with the institution itself. And that's something that the pandemic needs to have institutions refocusing on. Like, we haven't been doing things well. So why? Well, we know why. We've got a lot of scholarship. We've got a lot of voices saying it. But are you willing to listen and actually start implementing that change, I guess, is what the fall is going to have to bring a lot more than probably what institutions are comfortable with. But I mean, I think that's where we are.
So I want to kind of continue on in thinking about kind of post-pandemic and equity frameworks and anti-racism. And one of the things that came up for me, maybe that's because I've been thinking about this and I also just did an interview about it, is, we know that COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on Black communities, right? We are in this moment with kind of, police violence against Black people. And we also know that, the impact of this police violence affects Black people collectively, even if we don't know the victims, right? And so I know the question here is about how higher ed can, address issues related to students of color, but I think that part of the anti-racist framework is also to think about targeting and who needs what. And I think given the ways in which these two forces have really connected and is destructive to Black people in particular, and the history of anti-Blackness in this country, that I also want institutions to be thinking about, what are you going to be doing for Black students in particular? And I say that not to say that you're not thinking about all the other students, right? But, literally, like, are these two forces that have really kind of coalesced to affect our communities. And I know we're talking about students, but also, like, we're the ones that, these students might be coming to kind of like, for support. So how do you also support Black staff and faculty to support, right, Black students? And one of the things that I thought about is, and that's related to kind of conversations about just generally addressing hostile racial climates, but I'm also thinking about mental health. Right? Like, literally, exactly. Like, I don't know any Black person right now who, isn't going through, something like, and so, we're going to have a lot, Black students coming in who have been out protesting, who have families who are protesting, who have families who, I know Black students specifically at my institution who had family members suffering from COVID-19, right? And so there's the stress of dealing with that, and also the stress of, right simultaneously dealing with this kind of collective dehumanization of Black bodies. And so institutions are gonna have to grapple with how to support Black students in particular, and how to, have, culturally competent support on their campuses. That is not just like go to the health center, that you're gonna need people who are really skilled in addressing these issues, right? And bringing together the ways in which that overlaps with first-gen low income status, right? I know as someone who comes from that group, that like therapy is just not one of those things that was part of my language, right? And so it's also kind of thinking about and providing, like, students themselves may not know like what what resources to kind of seek out. And so, that's, I feel like those are some things that's coming up for me that I'm hoping that institutions are really thinking about how to address, kind of in, they kind of, yeah. So that's just some of the things that's coming up for me related to the pandemic.
I mean, I just saw an article today that showed that Black people are dying at the same rate, at similar rates as whites who are 10 to 15 years older than they are. So it's the shift in just risk and everything that happens with later in life. They're showing that the rates of African Americans are similar or higher. The rates of death are similar or higher than those who are 10 years older than them. And that is, and when you think about loss and how some of this is also coupled with, and this is also one of the things where social class is not even a buffer, because how many black folks in America are one generation removed from less stable background, but even if you are from a much more stable background, think about the work of Mary Patillo and others, your immediate first cousins may be the people who are in jail, who are more likely to be an essential worker, but not as a doctor, but rather as someone who is cleaning up. I'm thinking about my own situation, because now I am the professor. My brother, is a janitor. He has to go to work, and just that level of exposure and how it's taxing us, let alone we're supposed to still be publishing and doing interviews and doing, and writing and all that kind of stuff like that. Just the cognitive stress that it's having on COVID is affecting everybody, but then also disproportionately Black folks. The riots are disproportionately affecting Black people, but now you have a different set of worries, because now you're trying to figure out how many text messages you're going to get to check and see if you're okay. You have to have the energy to respond to them, but you also have to do work. But then now you have both of these things, and now people are trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen when you come back to campus? What is the responsibility of the university should we let students protest? Should we support students? Or should we try to police them in different kind of ways, right? What are the ways? And so all of these questions, and the question for me is, how much extra work will this put on faculty of color in general, but disproportionately Black faculty? How much is this is going to cause tension within departments about how to respond? You mentioned the resources on campus. I'm thinking about, will this then be disproportionately only send all the Black students to that one Black counselor in mental health services, if you even have a Black counselor? And here I am not thinking about just a type of school, but also location of school, because it is much harder to hire, and for reasons why we are experiencing now, that there are certain parts of the country or certain cities that it is harder to hire a person of color and keep them for more than 2 or 3 years because of the hostile climate of the town and of the university, right? And so I'm thinking about, how do we also make sure that it is not just a job of Black folks to take care of everybody at the university, especially during this time when they have not been trained to even deal with the students who they had in the best of times. How are they going to help people now?
I'm sorry, like, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something coming into this, I'm like, okay, focus on the students, focus on the students. But I can't just, because a lot of times, like, we, Black faculty or faculty of color, we're the ones who, right, students are coming to and do the kind of invisible labor. And it's interesting, and it's gender too, right? And
Extremely.
So it's interesting to think about, as I think about going back to campus and at an institution that's like, y'all gonna come back. Like, that's just what it is. And unless you're gonna die, have a sickness that's gonna allow you to die, like, you're coming back. And so, to think about then the kind of gendered labor, that the fact that the labor that's happening in homes is gendered regardless of race, but add on to the fact that, like, as a Black woman, like, the communities to which I belong to, and then to say, like, okay, and here you have these other things kind of going on. So I think, it's really kind of interconnected, where, I'm part of the same community as my students, right? The same thing that's kind of impacting them. I can't just kind of disengage from that. But I don't think that those are things necessarily that institutions are thinking about. We already do invisible labor, as Anthony brought up earlier. And this is going to add to that invisible labor at a time where, like, like, we're stretched thin, and, like, we're, this is a really difficult time, for Black folks kind of overall. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Anthony.
And we haven't, as I want to throw in one last thing, we haven't even talked about the rise in domestic violence and other issues that have disproportionately affected students. Again, even for our students who are queer, questioning, and trans, race amplifies the effect the negative experience that they have in many ways. I mean, think about how surprised people were that people were protesting the loss of life of a Black trans person. Right, that was a surprise, because we are so used to turning our backs on the most disadvantaged of the disadvantaged in certain respect, that we are now here. But what about our students who are experiencing certain things like that at home, who are going to come back to campus? When even if they would open up, even if they felt comfortable opening up to somebody, but that person had to have some kind of point of connection with them. There are many students at many universities who do not see a person who looks like them, even though that may be a 50-50 chance they may actually understand. There are so few people who have another person on campus who can actually go for them.
Yo, we have 10 minutes. I'm just saying.
I saw that too. It was like,
I'm sorry, shocked me. I was like, what?
This is a short coffee break.
I know. I just want to add in that I think both of your comments, Bedelia and Tony, I think this comes back to Tony's point about this sort of first step of doing the background work that has been missing for so many white people, whether they're students, administrators, faculty members, whoever. And, on the one hand, I'm envisioning lots of white students now enrolling in classes on race and wanting to come and talk to faculty members of color, and particularly Black faculty members, and what that adds also. And on the one hand, that's sort of a positive outcome. We want white students to be engaged in this. On the other hand, as you both have talked about, and as we already know, that's added invisible labor, and labor for which faculty members don't get a lot of acknowledgement or credit towards tenure, etc. And so it's invisible, and as you're saying, takes away from other things that we need to do for our jobs. So I think there's this additional element as well. And so part of the question, Tony, to your point about, like, campuses need to do this background work. How do we support white students doing their own background work before, so that we're not saying, go and talk to, Professor Richards about this, go and talk to Professor Jack about this, and, lines forming outside your offices.
I tell them to hire Race Talk LLC. That's what I tell them. Or get the university, right, to
Better
hire
invest.
But Liz, you also bring up something. I mean, we've had conversations at different schools about extending the clock of junior faculty members. But also we had conversation why some schools aren't extending the clock or giving, adjunct professors or contingent hires automatic renewal at this particular time, right? And so who does that disproportionately hurt? But the question is, because like to finish up, everybody talking about the new normal or going back to normal. I'm like, this is a moment that we can reset the rules. There's a reason that we can, and we already knew the system was rigged to work for some people before. We've documented this. We're still working on this. But if we can actually pay attention to research and design a much more equitable system, it won't be perfect, but a much more equitable system, why can't we take into consideration the invisible labor when it comes to promotion or retention of contract, especially for contingent faculty and especially for faculty of color, women, and faculty who are queer, let alone someone who's at the intersection of those, given how much extra work that they do that cannot get written up on your CV. You can't tell when you are the person in the department that is, advising 3 times as many students as everybody else, even though they know you are, but there's no metric in which you can actually show it for evaluation. Like, will we actually take in all the extra work that faculty and staff are doing right now as part of the evaluation system that we have in higher education, because we know just how biased end of the year course reviews are, especially after students know they're not going to get that A in the course. You can already know that your review is going to be biased downward, and biased downward even more if you're a person of color or a woman or some, you can. I'm just wondering about the ways in which we would fail ourselves and the next few generations if we don't use this moment not as a reset, but as a full-blown restart in being able to define new rules based upon the lessons learned of from previous generations. I think we would be doing ourselves and future generations a disservice if we try to go back to normal. Why go backwards when we have a moment to actually be informed moving forward?
Yeah, that normal wasn't working for everybody, right? And that's what people need to recognize. I think one of the points that Bedelia brought up that's really important and everybody echoes is, valuing, paying for changing policies around the invisible labor, right? Specifically around faculty and staff, but also acknowledging that the reason why it's invisible in the first place is there's an invisibility of labor by whites, right? Like, this stuff wouldn't be an issue if people actually contributed equitably and valued things, right? Like, it's not just like, okay, we'll add on to your tenure clock, we'll give you a little extra X pay, whatever. That doesn't actually change what the main issue is, and that's people aren't actually doing their damn jobs, right? And it won't fly. We can change everything, faculty wise, and we can hire more faculty, but if we still see the same patterns of devaluing, letting people slide, then it's really not going to, fix things. It's just going to kind of reinforce them again. I guess, thinking back to something that Tony brought up earlier about changing things that really haven't worked in a while. You mentioned something about some SAT, ACTs going away, and I saw that good old U.S. News and World Report's like, hey, we can rank these test blind institutions so that that they're good. And it's like, but we know that the reason why rankings matter is because it reinforces the status hierarchy of colleges and universities so that the rich get richer still by ranking whatever, it's like 7.5% or something of U.S. News and World Report ranking is based off of standardized test scores. So now you're going to come up with a new one that reinforces that without having the test scores. So you're saying that you're just going to rebuild the same system again for the institutions that have decided not to do it. And you know that parents and students and guidance counselors help kind of look at that, and the institutions are thinking about this as a way of reinforcing why they need to, be in this certain light, even though they might not be doing very well when it comes to equity and inclusion things that we've been talking about, right? So it's, again, that's going to be really interesting.
But Carson, that's also, but I always feel a little, there's a part of me that always, like, I understand the argument against ranking. And I have a big, I had a big issue with like the New York Times top 100. And I'm just like, because when I looked at the schools that have policies that induce food insecurity and housing insecurity amongst their students, like it almost mapped on, like the students who, the college that were at the top of their list for whatever metric that they have, it didn't take into consideration student experience at all, right? It didn't understand how students were moving through. They use these, this fascination with quantification and education and research in general. Let's put that aside. But I also think about how without the name brand, how many populations would not know about about certain schools, especially when I think about liberal arts colleges, especially when I think about schools that are not in big conferences for sports that just happen to also be good academic institutions, right? I think about people outside of the immediate South who knew that Duke was a good school, who didn't follow basketball, right? Or, who knew to go to Michigan because it's a great institution and it happens to be a sports powerhouse, right? I joke with people. I said, growing up, there were only 3 Ivy League schools: Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And the only reason why people knew about Princeton was because of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? And so like just things like that about, like just moments in which I wonder who would not know, or and who would not trust, what populations would not know and not trust certain schools that they didn't know that, oh, it's ranked number this or it's ranked number that. That's my only worry. If, I wrote in the New York Times, not as for the whole article, but as part of one that I wrote, that I was in favor of the SAT dashboard when it was rolled out, because I, one, did not expect them to do anything like that. But more importantly, two, it was kind of like using the very research that many people have been talking about, that the SAT did not account for where you went to school, the type of neighborhoods you lived in, and kind of like structural inequalities. But the only reason I really came down is because I did not believe that universities would voluntarily walk away from the SAT unless there was some kind of otherworldly shock to the system that forced them to. And lo and behold, that is potentially what COVID could do. And I hope that universities follow others like the UC system, Harvard, and a couple other places that are waiving it. I'm actually in favor of, if we can get away from it all, let's do it. I'd rather not have it than have one that begins to account for how many mistakes it makes, right? Will we do it? I'm not sure. There's a lot of money involved, and we all know, like that's the biggest thing. Can these universities get away from, and how much will College Board actually fight to cement themselves in the lives of access to higher education? That to me is going to be the biggest thing. Is there enough money? Are they willing to move away from that much money to actually do what is right? And America's history tells me that the answer is hell no.
The exclamation point.
But I'm optimistic.
Yeah. Honestly, that's the one thing why I didn't want to leave, because I was like, we need to talk about admissions policies and the fact that if institutions can waive this thing this year, let's just leave it, just let it be. And also thinking about to me, it's actually mind-boggling that so many higher ed institutions claim to be committed to diversity and equity, when literally, when you think about things, not just, kind of test optional use of the SATs, but thinking about things like legacies, right? Literally, you're having a policy that privileges rich white people, right? But you care about diversity and equity? Come on now, right? So I think, what I would love to see institutions do kind of moving forward is really reconsider. And by reconsider, I mean drop legacy preferences right? And using standardized testing, which the literature clearly shows with the SATs that it doesn't, it doesn't reflect how well students do in their first year. So why are we using it? And that we know that it has a racist roots, right? So it's just kind of mind-boggling to me that these things remain in place alongside institutions claiming that, you know, they really care about diversity and equity. And you know what? If they did away with that, then okay, forget it. Then we can have a barter. Forget about affirmative action, just do away with that. Because I guarantee you, right, just doing away with that would make schools much more diverse and equitable, right? Without having something that white folks use, right, as a thing to say, you're the ones who are not qualified, as opposed to looking at, you know, those who are already privileged. So I really hope that there's a conversation, that the pandemic opens up a conversation for, you know, why we don't really need this. And I'm a pessimist like you, but I'm kind of optimistic. Like, there's so much, you know, data behind getting rid of this that I'm like, I want to be optimistic that if enough of us drive this home, right, that they'll consider it. And the fact that they've done it in 1 year, right, should. But anyway, yeah, I just really wanted to make sure we had that conversation before we got off this talk today.
Yeah, and outlaw those $3,000 summer test prep classes and stuff. It's like, okay, yeah. Again, the whole kind of industry behind that, right? Of trying to support the test. It goes beyond higher education to, you know, millions and millions of dollars. It also just shows how much, you know, even though they don't predict past your first year of college, right, that self-reports that if you feel like you were prepared, usually you will be okay in college. A lot of it's a confidence thing, and not just, you know, a test, right? Or, you know, grades are better predictors. And like you said, Bedelia, we know these things.
Yeah,
it would just be nice if, you know, maybe, just maybe, we would use research a little bit more instead of just kind of going off of some.
But do they really not know, though? I mean, do they really not know?
Yeah, but the thing is,
do they really want to know?
Right, but how much easier it is to create a class when you can automatically screen people based upon something that it is, right? Like, you know, I mean, we're talking about undergraduates right now, but what about the LSAT? What about the GRE?
GMAT, MCAT,
right?
everything.
You know, all, you know, I mean, I'm sure that there are some that do better, because you actually do need to understand some chemical principles or all that kind of stuff like that. But I mean, you know, that the SAT tests two things. What you don't know and how much money your mama got. Like, that's really what it really is. That's how much it tests. I mean, like, you know, let's just put it out there too. I mean, the admission scandal put this on Front Street, and they still don't want to get away from it.
Oh,
right? Like, I think is, you know, thinking about how much the getting into college is this billion-dollar industry. It involves so many different players, and the people who are able to game it are those who have been gaming it their entire life. Like, the neighborhoods you choose, the schools you choose, the kind of opportunity hoarding. You're just like literally paying somebody to teach your child how to cheat the SAT is like literally putting a cherry on top of the most decadent cake you can possibly have. Like, it's like diabetes plus, like that. Yeah, whatever. Like, you're not even really working. You're not even doing much, because your child, by virtue of all the extra resources it had, but we didn't move from that, right? And like, so getting rid of legacy admissions and getting rid of like Z-list and all this kind of stuff like that, I think would be a step in the right direction. I would love to see how we're going to deal with respect to athletics as well, right? Are we going to continue to have that kind of preference?
Yeah, because not everybody is, you know, all these discussions about athletes. It's like, look, there's only so many people even on a football and a basketball team.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And the sailing, beach volleyball, and all these others.
Equestrian.
It's a very interesting conversation with my students when we talk about this. Yeah.
Water polo. I mean, come on.
And those, at least one could argue, at least those sports bring in money. But anyway, I just, it is very, like, the whole nature of the conversation to, like, we have been dealt one of the most, especially in the US, one of the most potent 1-2 punches that our nation has had to deal with, right? You know, in a very, very long time. First the pandemic, then the nation being made aware of so many acts of violence against Black bodies by the police and by citizens, in such a short period of time that we are reeling from it. And one of the questions that we were supposed to consider is, and we've been talking about it, but what is the role of higher education, not just looking internally, but the external impact, right? Not just what's going to happen when our students return to campus and our faculty and our staff members, but what is the role of higher education in this moment, right? I have never received more communication from college presidents taking stances before. Of all the things that we have been through lately, in the last 10 years, definitely in the last 4, to receive so many statements, but I wonder, okay, that's what you're saying to us, but what does this university mean to the outside world? What does it mean to the people who share the same zip code but don't share the living spaces, the town gown divide? How do we think about our local communities? What is our place in the world? And I don't have an answer, but I was appreciative of that question being there, because what are our institutions' role in the national conversation, but also local, about COVID, about race relations, about police brutality, and as Matthew Clare talks about mass criminalization, beyond mass incarceration, right? You know, what is our role? Like, we are these intellectual hubs that study this and produce the information. But, you know, part of me is like, we only write for ourselves, right? We don't, so many of us believe that engaging with wider audiences is below our research. We should be more talking to other PhDs and publishing it in journals and using big words that alienate, 75% of the population. Like, what is our role? What is our role for this national conversation that we need to have in this deep dive that clearly the nation was looking for, because they've never had this many Black authors and women on the New York Times bestseller list before? Like, where are we now? What do we do?
As I'm thinking about that question, Anthony, I'm thinking about, like, I think that wherever higher education institutions are, they should strive to have the communities around them actually like them, right? And respect them, right? Because I can't, I think that there are a lot of rich institutions that go into communities, and the people who live in those communities have a very kind of antagonistic relationship with the institution, right? So that's what I mean. Like, what are you doing, right, to cultivate, to be part, to be part of the community, for the community to see, you sharing space with them as an asset, right? And that you're giving back, right? And there are lots of ways that can happen. I think for some institutions, that's kind of the community engagement aspect of it. And I think people should I think that institutions could stay in their lane. Like, what do you do and what do you do well? And can provide that service to institutions. Like, I think at my university, there's a Center for Civic Engagement, for example, that partners with community organizations that might, let's say, have a problem, and then professors can then use their research skills, right, and collaborate and do that. Another thing that we could do is to place more value on community engaged scholarship, right, which takes a lot more work than a lot more work and kind of effort, right? And so if we're just kind of quantifying 1, 2, 3, I think that I think that would provide an incentive, because I think that's also how this happens. Can we allow folks who are incarcerated to take classes and get degrees, right? So I think that there's so many ways, and you know, in which, and live your values. Like I was on, you know, I don't remember what school it was, but I was so profoundly touched by the institution. I was at Missouri that had, you know, the statement that talked about kind of, you know, changing the relationship that they had with the, you know, with the police in the town. And for me, powerful statements are ones about, this is what we're gonna do, and this is what we have done. And that's what I really like about it. And so that's what I would also want these institutions to do, is to not just say, we value Black lives and we value this, and to say, we value it, and this is, and now show us, like, this is what I'm gonna do differently, or this is what we have been doing, and we're gonna build on it, right? Like, those are things that I think, ways in which I think institutions can really, you know, act in a way that really kind of furthers, addresses some of these societal inequities.
I would just want to add on that I think in terms of the town gown piece, it's such a long-term process, and I think there's been a lot of trust that has been lost, or maybe was never there, because universities, like many other entities, are often self-interested. And so regardless of the actual motivation of the involvement, often what's perceived as, you're doing this for your benefit because you want to be able to say, look at all the fantastic stuff that we're doing, and look, and, you know, say to students, look how you can benefit from this. It's not a partnership. It's something for the university or the college campus to benefit from. And so I think campuses have a lot of work. Not all campuses, some have better and longer term relationships, but for a lot of campuses that want to move in this direction, there is going to be a lot of reckoning with past damage and loss of trust.
And I think that all goes back to this kind of conversation of, how is higher education a public good, and how do we need to kind of re-envision what that is? That when people talk about higher education as a public good, it doesn't mean that you and me and everybody else gets, you know, what we need, that it has a bigger impact off campus and among homes, not just within 1 or 2 or 3 homes, right, in a community. There's a lot more that has to go on in, you know, reimagining or even contemplating that maybe when that whole conversation about higher education as a public good was created, not everybody was considered part of that public in the first place, right? And I think that's where we are right now. It looks like we're being told that we have to go back to work, and my coffee is empty. So I guess with that, we'll just kind of go around real quick and just give a little soundbite about some of our work and how people can reach out to us if they need to, starting with you, Bedelia.
Oh boy, I think I was the least prepared for this. Well, first of all, thank you. No, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, you know, for organizing this. Liz, Carson, you know, Anthony, I'm, you know, really excited to kind of connect with you virtually. For those who would like to get in contact, I am here at Race Talk LLC at bedelia@racetalk.com. So check me out if you'd like to have someone help you facilitate conversations about race in the classroom and for other racial equity needs. That's it.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all for this invite. I mean, it's so good to, like I said from the beginning, I knew it was going to be good. You can find me at, you know, Anthony_Jack@gse.harvard.edu. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, I just really, really enjoyed this conversation and thinking both about what's happening in higher education, but also the nation as a whole.
I'll echo the thanks. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff and hear from all of you. You can find me at elee@sju.edu or on my website, elizabethmlee.com.
I'm going to actually give my UR address, which is BRICHAR2 @richmond.edu.
There we go. Yeah, I just realized the last time we all happened to meet each other was at ESS in Philly right before COVID. So here we are when we're all reopening. Yeah, coincidental. If people are interested in getting in touch with me, they can hit me up on Twitter or through email at wcbyrd@umich.edu. It's the easiest way. But hopefully we can all figure out a way to continue this conversation in person one day in the near 6 months to a year, and definitely virtually again. But it was great to hang out with everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching Coffee Breaks with Scholars, presented by the Diversity Scholars Network and the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. For more information about the Diversity Scholars Network, visit lsa.umich.edu/ncid or email diversityscholars@umich.edu.